The mining drone worked without sound in the cold darkness of space. Its metal arms dug deep into the asteroid, searching for precious metals that the Zephyrian Empire needed for their war machines. The drone had been working for 3 days when its drill hit something strange. Instead of rock, it found metal. Very old metal. The impact sent vibrations through the asteroid. Deep inside, lights began to flicker. Systems that had been sleeping for over 300 years started to wake up. Emergency power flowed through circuits that had waited in the dark for so long. Captain Jake Morrison felt cold. Very cold. His body was stiff and his mind was foggy. Slowly, he began to remember where he was. The last thing he recalled was climbing into the cryopod as Earth burned behind them. The Zephyrians had come without warning. They destroyed everything. Cities, ships, people. Everything that made Earth home was gone. Jake opened his eyes and saw the familiar blue glow of the cryo bay. He was aboard the USS Valiant, humanity's greatest ship. Around him, thousands of other pods were starting to open. His crew was waking up too. They were the last humans in the galaxy, and they had been asleep for a very long time. Aria's voice filled the chamber. She was the ship's computer, but she was much more than that. She could think and learn just like a person. "Captain Morrison, welcome back," she said in her calm voice. "I have much to tell you." Jake tried to sit up, but his muscles were weak. The cryo-sleep had kept him alive, but his body needed time to work properly again. "How long, Aria?" he asked. "How long have we been asleep?" 326 years, Captain, Aria replied. "The date is now 2847 by the old Earth calendar." The words hit Jake like a punch to the stomach. Over 3 centuries had passed. Everyone they had ever known was dead. Their families, their friends, their world, all gone. Jake looked around at his crew members who were slowly climbing out of their pods. They all had the same lost look in their eyes. Commander Lisa Park was the first to fully stand. She was Jake's second in command and one of the best pilots he had ever seen. She walked over to Jake with shaky steps. "Sir, what's our situation?" she asked. Jake looked at her and then at the others. Admiral Ben Carter was helping Dr. Amy Rodriguez out of her pod. Engineer Tony Brooks was already checking the ship's systems on a nearby computer. These people had trusted him to lead them to safety. Now he had to figure out what safety meant in a galaxy that had forgotten humanity existed. Aria began to explain what she had learned during their long sleep. The Zephyrian Empire now controlled most of the galaxy. They had told everyone that humans were extinct. They said humans were dangerous and had to be destroyed for the good of all species. The lie had become truth in the minds of billions of beings across the stars. "What about Earth?" Dr. Rodriguez asked. Her voice was small and afraid. "Gone," Aria said simply. "The Zephyrians turned it into a dead rock. Nothing lives there now." The silence that followed was heavy and painful. Jake felt anger rising in his chest, but he pushed it down. Anger would not help them now. They needed to think clearly and plan carefully. The Valiant was more than just a ship. It was a flying city with everything needed to support human life. It had factories that could build other ships. It had farms that could grow food. It had weapons that could destroy entire fleets. Most importantly, it had the technology to rebuild human civilization from nothing. Jake walked to the main view screen and looked outside. The asteroid field around them was dark and quiet. No ships were nearby, but that would change soon. The mining drone had damaged their hiding place. The Zephyrians would come to investigate. "Aria, how long before they find us?" Jake asked. "Based on their patrol patterns, I estimate 6 hours, Captain," Aria replied. 6 hours to decide the fate of humanity. Jake looked at his crew again. They were all looking at him, waiting for orders. These 50,000 people were all that remained of the human race. What he decided next would determine if humanity had a future or if they would join Earth in death. Commander Park stepped beside him. "What are your orders, Captain?" she asked. Jake thought about the Zephyrians who had destroyed his world. He thought about all the other species living under their rule. He thought about the choice he had to make. They could hide and try to survive in secret. They could attack and try to fight a war they could not win. Or they could do something else, something the galaxy had never seen before. "We're going to remind the galaxy what humanity stands for," Jake said finally. "We're going to show them that there's a better way to live than under the boot of an empire that rules through fear." The crew looked confused, but they trusted their captain. They had followed him this far. They would follow him wherever he led them next. The USS Valiant powered up its engines for the first time in over 3 centuries. Humanity was about to return to the galaxy. Commander Lisa Park climbed into the cockpit of her stealth fighter. The small ship was unlike anything the current galaxy had ever seen. It could become invisible to all sensors and move faster than most ships could even detect. Lisa had flown these fighters during the war against the Zephyrians, but that felt like yesterday and forever ago at the same time. "Remember, this is just reconnaissance," Jake told her over the radio. "We need to know what we're dealing with out there." Lisa nodded and powered up her engines. The fighter slipped out of the Valiant's hangar bay like a ghost. She flew past the asteroid field and into open space, her ship completely hidden from any watching eyes. What she found shocked her beyond words. The galaxy had changed completely. Everywhere she looked, she saw Zephyrian ships and stations. They had built a massive empire on the bones of the civilizations they had conquered. Slave ships carried workers between worlds. Warships patrolled every system. Fear ruled everything. Lisa flew closer to a nearby station and listened to their communications. The Zephyrians talked about the different species they controlled like they were property. They discussed which worlds to strip mine next and which populations needed to be reduced for being too troublesome. She recorded everything and returned to the Valiant. When she showed the crew what she had found, the anger in the room was thick enough to cut. These people had destroyed not just humanity, but freedom itself. "How many ships do they have?" Admiral Carter asked. He was already thinking about military options. "Too many," Lisa replied. "They control hundreds of systems. Their fleet is massive." Dr. Rodriguez studied the recordings of alien species being forced to work in terrible conditions. "These people are suffering just like we did," she said. "The Zephyrians didn't just destroy Earth. They destroyed hope." Jake stared at the images of slave ships and prison worlds. The Zephyrians had turned the galaxy into a nightmare, but something inside him refused to accept that this was how things had to be. Area's sensors detected movement at the edge of the system. "Captain, a Zephyrian patrol fleet is approaching our position," she announced. 12 ships, led by a heavy cruiser." The crew looked at Jake, waiting for orders. They could destroy the patrol easily. The Valiant's weapons were far more advanced than anything the Zephyrians had. But Jake remembered his promise. He had said they would show the galaxy a better way. "Open a channel to all Zephyrian frequencies," Jake ordered. "Sir?" Lisa asked, confused. "You heard me. I want every Zephyrian ship, station, and world to hear this message." Aria worked quickly to break through the Empire's communication networks. Within minutes, she had access to everything. "Channel open, Captain," she said. Jake took a deep breath and spoke into the microphone. His voice was calm and clear. "This is Captain Jake Morrison of the human vessel USS Valiant. Humanity has returned." The effect was immediate and dramatic. Across the Empire, communication networks exploded with activity. Zephyrian commanders demanded confirmation. Politicians called emergency meetings. Citizens who had been told humans were extinct suddenly learned that everything they had been taught was a lie. On the bridge of the approaching cruiser, Commander Vex Thule stared at his communication officer in disbelief. "That's impossible," he said. "Humans are extinct. We made sure of that." "Sir, the transmission is definitely coming from that asteroid field," the officer replied. "And our sensors are detecting massive energy readings from that location." Thule felt a cold fear creep up his spine. Every Zephyrian knew the stories about humans. They were told that humans were dangerous because they refused to accept proper authority. They fought for something called freedom, which made them impossible to control. That's why they had to be destroyed. But if humans were back, what did that mean for the Empire? Across the galaxy, the same question was being asked on thousands of worlds. Emperor Vex Corthane received the news while sitting on his throne on the capital world. He had built his entire rule on the idea that he had saved the galaxy from the human threat. Now that threat had returned. "Send the Third Fleet," he ordered his generals. "Destroy them before this gets out of hand." But it was already too late. The message had been heard by every species in the Empire. On slave worlds, workers stopped their labor and looked up at the sky. In prison camps, guards found themselves facing prisoners who suddenly had hope in their eyes again. Back on the Valiant, Jake watched the chaos his simple message had caused. Communication networks across the Empire were buzzing with activity. Some Zephyrians were calling for immediate military action. Others were asking questions that hadn't been asked in centuries. "Captain," Arya said, "I'm detecting massive fleet movements throughout the Empire. It appears your message has caused quite a reaction." Engineer Tony Brooks looked up from his station. "Sir, our manufacturing bays are ready to begin production. We could have a full battle fleet ready in 6 months." Jake shook his head. "We're not going to fight them with ships and weapons, Tony. We're going to fight them with something much more powerful." "What's that, sir?" Dr. Rodriguez asked. Jake smiled for the first time since waking up. "The truth. We're going to show the galaxy what they've been missing. We're going to remind them that there's more to life than fear and slavery." Commander Park frowned. "How do we do that, Captain?" "By being human," Jake replied. "By showing them what humanity really stands for. Not through conquest or domination, but through cooperation and hope." The Zephyrian patrol fleet was getting closer. They would arrive within the hour. Jake had to make a choice that would determine not just the fate of his crew, but the future of every living being in the galaxy. He looked at his officers, these brave people who had trusted him with their lives. They had followed him into the unknown once before. Now he was asking them to do something even more difficult. He was asking them to choose hope over revenge, understanding over hatred. "All stations, prepare for contact with the Zephyrian fleet," Jake announced. "But remember, we're not here to start a war, we're here to end one." Dr. Amy Rodriguez had always been curious about other species. Before the war, she had studied alien cultures and languages. Now, as she analyzed the Zephyrian communications that Arya was intercepting, she discovered something that changed everything. The Empire was not as strong as it appeared. The intercepted messages told a different story. Rebellions happened constantly across their territory. Entire worlds lived in fear of their Zephyrian overlords. Species that had once been proud and free were now broken and hopeless. Amy brought her findings to Captain Morrison. "Jake, you need to see this," she said, showing him the data on her tablet. "The Empire is built on lies and fear. The Zephyrians don't rule because they're loved or respected. They rule because everyone is too afraid to fight back." Jake studied the information carefully. Messages between Zephyrian commanders revealed the truth about their empire. They talked about putting down uprisings on dozens of worlds. They discussed which populations needed to be disciplined for showing signs of independence. They worried constantly about maintaining control. "How many species are under their control?" Jake asked. "At least 47 major civilizations," Amy replied, "and hundreds of smaller ones, all of them living under Zephyrian rule, all of them dreaming of freedom, but too scared to act." Admiral Carter joined them on the bridge. Captain, the Zephyrian fleet will be here in 30 minutes. What are your orders? Jake looked at the approaching ships on the main screen. 12 vessels armed with enough weapons to destroy a small moon. But they weren't his real enemy. His real enemy was the system of fear and oppression that had made the galaxy forget what freedom looked like. Area? Can you break into their main broadcast networks again? Jake asked. Yes, Captain. I can reach every world in the Empire simultaneously, the AI replied. Do it. I want to address the entire galaxy. Within minutes, Aria had taken control of every communication system in Zephyrian space. On thousands of worlds, billions of beings suddenly found their screens showing the bridge of a human ship. Many of them had never seen a human before. They had been told humans were monsters who wanted to destroy everything good in the galaxy. Instead, they saw Jake Morrison, a tired man with kind eyes and a gentle voice. People of the galaxy, Jake began. My name is Jake Morrison. I am human. I know you've been told that my people were evil and had to be destroyed. I know you've been told that the Zephyrian Empire saved you from us. But I want you to know the truth. On a mining world called Keth Prime, workers stopped their digging to watch the strange transmission. They had never heard anyone speak to them like this before. No Zephyrian had ever called them people. They were always called workers or subjects or worse. Jake continued his speech. Humans believed that every intelligent being had the right to live freely. We believed that no one should be forced to serve another against their will. We believed that all species could work together as equals, not as masters and slaves. On the bridge of the approaching Zephyrian cruiser, Commander Thule watched the transmission with growing alarm. Cut the signal, he ordered. I can't, sir, his communication officer replied. They've taken control of our entire network. I can't stop it. Jake spoke about Earth and how humans had lived. He talked about democracy and freedom of speech. He described a world where different peoples worked together to solve problems instead of fighting each other. Most importantly, he talked about hope. The Zephyrians want you to believe that their way is the only way, Jake said. They want you to think that freedom leads to chaos and war. But we proved that's not true. Different species can live together in peace. Everyone can have a voice in how they're governed. No one has to live in fear. Dr. Rodriguez had prepared visual materials to go with Jake's speech. Images of human cities where different alien species had lived and worked together. Pictures of the old Galactic Council where every world had an equal vote. Videos of human children playing with alien children, all of them laughing and happy. On slave worlds across the Empire, beings who had forgotten how to hope began to remember. They saw what life could be like without fear. They saw that the Zephyrian way was not the only way. Engineer Tony Brooks had been working with Aria to demonstrate human technology. As Jake spoke, they showed how human ships could repair themselves using nanotechnology. They demonstrated medical scanners that could cure diseases instantly. They revealed agricultural systems that could end hunger forever. We're not asking you to fight, Jake said. We're not asking you to die for us. We're simply asking you to remember that there's a better way to live. You don't have to accept oppression as normal. You don't have to live in fear. On the Zephyrian capital world, Emperor Corthane watched the transmission with rage. This human was undoing 3 centuries of careful control with a single speech. He turned to his generals. Send every ship we have. Destroy them now. But it was already too late. Across the Empire, something was changing. On factory worlds, workers began to whisper to each other about the humans' words. On agricultural planets, farmers looked up at the sky and wondered if freedom was really possible. Even on Zephyrian worlds, citizens began to ask questions they had never dared ask before. The transmission ended, but its effects were immediate. Protest movements that had been hiding in shadows suddenly found the courage to act. Planetary governors reported disturbances on dozens of worlds. The Empire's communication networks were flooded with messages asking if the humans' words were true. On the USS Valiant, Jake watched the reaction with amazement. He had hoped to plant seeds of doubt in the Empire's foundation. Instead, he had started a revolution. "Captain," Arya announced, "I'm detecting unusual activity on over 200 worlds. It appears your message has inspired widespread civil unrest." Commander Park looked at the tactical display showing the approaching Zephyrian fleet. "Sir, they'll be in weapons range in 5 minutes. Should we prepare for battle?" Jake shook his head. "No. We're going to show them something they've never seen before. We're going to show them what happens when you choose peace over violence." The fate of the galaxy now hung in the balance, but for the first time in centuries, that balance was tipping toward hope instead of fear. The Zephyrian fleet arrived expecting to find a small group of human survivors hiding in fear. Instead, they found the USS Valiant waiting for them with all its lights on, broadcasting welcome messages in dozens of languages. Commander Thule stared at the massive ship through his view screen. It was bigger than anything he had ever seen, and it didn't look like any warship in his database. Instead of weapon ports, he saw hangar bays and communication arrays. Instead of armor plating, he saw observation decks and gardens visible through transparent sections. "Sir, they're not raising shields or powering weapons," his tactical officer reported. "They're just sitting there." "It's a trap," Thule muttered. "It has to be a trap." Jake Morrison's voice came over the communication channel. "Commander Thule, this is Captain Morrison. I'd like to invite you and your officers aboard our ship for dinner." The bridge of the Zephyrian cruiser fell silent. In 300 years of Empire history, no enemy had ever invited them to dinner. Thule didn't know how to respond. His training had prepared him for battle, not for hospitality. "This is some kind of human trick," Thule said to his crew. "They're trying to confuse us." But even as he spoke, reports were coming in from across the Empire. The human broadcast had caused chaos on hundreds of worlds. Governors were demanding military support to put down uprisings. Some planets had declared independence entirely. Others were simply refusing to send their usual tribute payments to the capital. On Keth Prime, the mining supervisor found his workers, gathered in the main plaza instead of reporting to their shifts. They weren't rioting or fighting. They were just talking to each other about the human's message. When he ordered them back to work, they looked at him with eyes that had lost their fear. "Why should we?" asked an old Kelleran miner named Doc. "The humans said we don't have to live like slaves. Maybe it's time we started living like people." Similar scenes were playing out across the galaxy. Species that had been broken by centuries of oppression were suddenly remembering what it felt like to have hope. They weren't calling for war or violence. They were simply refusing to accept that their current lives were the only option available to them. Commander Dan Phillips led the first diplomatic mission from the Valiant. His small shuttle approached a neutral trading station near the edge of Zephyrian space. The station's administrator, a nervous Trilaxian named Grem, agreed to meet with him only because he was curious about what humans actually looked like. Dan brought gifts instead of weapons, medical supplies that could cure genetic diseases common among Trilaxians, agricultural seeds that could grow in their harsh desert climate, technology blueprints that could improve their water purification systems. He asked for nothing in return, except the chance to talk. "But what do you want from us?" Grem asked suspiciously. He had dealt with Zephyrians his whole life. Everyone always wanted something. "We want to be friends," Dan replied simply. "We want to trade knowledge and help each other solve problems. We want to prove that different species can work together, without anyone having to be in charge of anyone else." Grem stared at the human in confusion. The concept of friendship between species was almost unknown in the current galaxy. Under Zephyrian rule, relationships were always about power. Someone was always the master and someone else was always the servant. But Dan seemed genuine. He shared stories about the old days when humans had worked alongside dozens of alien species, as equals. He showed videos of mixed crews on exploration ships, of interspecies families, of children from different worlds playing together without any thought of who was supposed to be superior to whom. Word of the meeting spread quickly through the underground networks that connected oppressed peoples across the galaxy. Other species began to reach out to the humans, asking if the offer of friendship was real. Dr. Susan Clark, the Valiant's xenobiologist, made a discovery that shocked everyone. While analyzing intercepted Zephyrian military communications, she found messages between Zephyrian scientists and philosophers. Many of them were expressing doubts about their empire's policies. "Jake, you need to hear this," Susan said, playing back a recorded conversation between two Zephyrian researchers. In the recording, they talked about how tired they were of the constant warfare and oppression. They discussed scientific discoveries that were being suppressed because they might give other species ideas about independence. "Even the Zephyrians are getting tired of their own system," Susan explained. "They're scared of their own government. Many of them want change, but don't know how to achieve it without being labeled as traitors." Jake realized that the Empire's foundation was even weaker than they had thought. It wasn't just the conquered species who were unhappy. Even the conquerors themselves were beginning to question whether their way of life was sustainable. On the capital world, Emperor Corthine faced a crisis unlike any in the Empire's history. His military commanders were reporting that entire fleets were refusing orders to attack civilian populations who were demanding reform. Some Zephyrian captains had actually joined the protesters on their worlds. "Crush them all!" Corthane screamed at his generals. "Execute anyone who questions our authority." But General Corax Thane, the Empire's top military leader, shook his head. "Your Majesty, if we follow that order, we'll have to execute half our own military. The humans have done something we never expected. They've made people think." The domino effect that Jake had hoped for was spreading faster than anyone had imagined. Species across the galaxy were talking to each other for the first time in centuries. They were sharing ideas and dreams of freedom. They were remembering that life didn't have to be about fear and submission. On the Valiant, reports came in from across the galaxy, peaceful demonstrations on mining worlds, trade unions forming on industrial planets, entire star systems declaring their intention to govern themselves democratically. The Empire was coming apart, but it wasn't collapsing into chaos. Instead, it was transforming into something new. "Captain," Arya announced, "I'm receiving messages from over 400 different species requesting information about human governmental systems. They want to know how democracy works." Jake smiled as he looked at the flood of requests for help and guidance. Humanity had returned to the galaxy not as conquerors, but as teachers. They were showing everyone that there was indeed a better way to live, and beings across the stars were choosing hope over fear, freedom over security, and cooperation over domination. The revolution had begun, and it was spreading without a single shot being fired. The meeting took place on a neutral space station called Haven Point. It had been suggested by Commander Thule, who had surprised everyone by accepting Captain Morrison's invitation to talks. The Zephyrian officer had spent 3 days aboard the Valiant and returned to his fleet a changed man. Jake Morrison sat across from General Corax Thane, the highest-ranking Zephyrian military officer willing to negotiate. Between them was a simple table with documents outlining a proposal that could change the galaxy forever. "You're asking us to give up everything," Thane said, his voice heavy with the weight of centuries of tradition. "The Empire is all we've ever known." Jake leaned forward. "I'm asking you to gain something better. I'm asking you to join a galaxy where strength comes from cooperation instead of conquest, where security comes from friendship instead of fear." Around the table sat representatives from dozens of species. Some had been slaves of the Empire for generations. Others had been allies or even Zephyrian citizens who had grown tired of the endless cycle of oppression and rebellion. All of them were there because they believed change was possible. Dr. Rodriguez presented the framework for what they were calling the Galactic Federation. Every world would have a voice in the government. Decisions would be made by majority vote, but minority rights would be protected. No species would be allowed to dominate another. Technology and resources would be shared freely to help everyone prosper. "It sounds impossible," said Commander Vex, a Zephyrian officer who had been monitoring the talks. "How do you prevent the strong from taking advantage of the weak?" Engineer Tony Brooks answered by showing them human technology in action. "When everyone has access to the same tools and knowledge, strength doesn't come from weapons. It comes from ideas and innovation. When you lift everyone up, everyone benefits." The demonstration was impressive. Human nanotechnology that could turn asteroids into floating gardens. Medical scanners that could cure diseases that had plagued some species for millennia. Educational systems that could teach anyone any skill they wanted to learn. The humans were offering to share all of it freely. But what's to stop someone from using this technology to build an army and conquer everyone else? Asked a representative from the Mollusk Consortium. Jake smiled. "The same thing that stopped you from doing it under the Empire. People who are happy and free don't want to conquer their neighbors. They want to trade with them, learn from them, and work together to solve common problems." On the capital world, Emperor Corthane watched the negotiations with growing desperation. His empire was dissolving around him. Entire sectors had declared independence and were setting up their own democratic governments. His own military was divided, with many officers openly supporting the human proposals. "We still have the Third Fleet," General Corax had told him before leaving for the negotiations. "We could destroy the human ship and end this revolution before it spreads further." But Corthine knew it was too late for that. The revolution had already spread. Destroying one ship wouldn't put the idea of freedom back in its cage. If anything, it would make the humans into martyrs and strengthen the resolve of those who wanted change. The Emperor faced a choice that would define his legacy. He could order a final, desperate attack that would destroy his own empire along with his enemies. Or he could accept that the old ways were finished and try to find a place for his people in whatever came next. At the negotiations, General Thane presented the Zephyrian position. "Many of our people are afraid," he said honestly. "For 300 years, we've been taught that we're superior to other species, that our way of life is the only way to maintain order in the galaxy. You're asking us to abandon everything we believe about ourselves." Commander Park, who had joined the talks as Jake's military advisor, nodded sympathetically. "We understand that fear. Humans went through the same thing when we first met other species. We thought we were alone in the universe, and then suddenly we had to learn how to be neighbors with beings who were completely different from us." "How did you do it?" Thane asked. "We made mistakes," Jake admitted. "Lots of them. But we learned that being different doesn't mean being enemies. We learned that cooperation makes everyone stronger, not weaker. Most importantly, we learned that respect and friendship are more powerful than fear and domination." Dr. Clark shared recordings of conversations with Zephyrian scientists and citizens who had been secretly communicating with the Valiant. They talked about their dreams of a galaxy where their children could grow up without the constant pressure of maintaining an empire through violence. They spoke of wanting to explore and discover new things instead of constantly fighting to suppress rebellions. "Your own people want this change," Jake said gently. "They're just afraid to say it out loud because they don't know if it's possible. We're here to show them that it is." The negotiations continued for days. Maps were drawn showing how the new federation would be organized. Treaties were drafted outlining the rights and responsibilities of member worlds. Plans were made for transitioning from imperial rule to democratic government. Not everyone was happy with the proposals. Some Zephyrian hardliners called for Thane's arrest for treason. Some conquered species wanted revenge for centuries of oppression. But the moderates on both sides worked to find solutions that everyone could accept. Lieutenant Colonel Ray Murphy coordinated the logistics of what would be the largest peaceful transition of power in galactic history. Thousands of worlds would need new governments. Millions of former slaves would need help starting new lives. The Empire's military would need to be restructured to serve as peacekeepers instead of oppressors. The breakthrough came when Thane received a message from Emperor Cortane himself. The Emperor had been watching the negotiations and the continuing demonstrations across his former empire. He had seen his own citizens marching in the streets, not for conquest or glory, but for the simple right to choose their own future. The old empire is dead, Corthane's message said. If we fight this change, we'll destroy ourselves and everyone else. I'm ordering all Imperial forces to lay down their arms and participate in the transition to the new Federation. The announcement sent shockwaves across the galaxy. Some hardline Imperial forces refused to obey and had to be dealt with by their own moderate commanders, but most of the Empire's military followed their Emperor's final order. On the Valiant, Jake watched as reports came in from across the galaxy. World after world was declaring its intention to join the Galactic Federation. Former enemies were working together to write new constitutions. The transition wasn't perfect, and there would be challenges ahead, but the foundation for a better future was being built. Captain, Arya said, I'm receiving a transmission from Earth. Jake's heart stopped. That's impossible. Earth is dead. Not anymore, sir. It appears that a group of automated terraforming systems activated when they detected the Valiant's return. Earth is beginning to heal itself. Jake stared at the message in wonder. Somehow, someway, humanity had planned for this moment even in their darkest hour. Earth would live again, and this time it would be part of a galaxy where all species could thrive together in peace. The first Galactic Federation Assembly convened on New Geneva, a world that had been chosen specifically because it had no ties to any empire or faction. Representatives from over 300 species gathered in a massive hall built by human, construction robots and Zephyrian engineers working side by side. Captain Jake Morrison stood at the central podium, but he wasn't there as a leader. He was there as humanity's representative, equal to every other delegate in the room. The old dreams of human democracy had been expanded to include the entire galaxy. Today we begin something that has never existed before, Jake said to the assembled delegates. A government based on the consent of the governed, a federation where every voice matters, regardless of the size or power of the world it comes from. In the audience, former Emperor Corthane sat with the Zephyrian delegation. He had voluntarily stepped down from power and now served as an advisor helping his people transition to democratic rule. Many of his former subjects had been surprised by his willingness to give up absolute authority, but Corthine had explained it simply. Power without the consent of the people is just another form of slavery, and I'm tired of being a slave to fear. Commander Helen Scott, formerly of the Zephyrian Navy, now served as Jake's liaison officer. She had been one of the first Imperial officers to openly support the Federation, and her courage had inspired many others to follow. She coordinated the massive effort to integrate former Imperial forces into the Federation's peacekeeping service. Dr. Rodriguez had been working with scientists from dozens of species to establish the Federation's Science Council. They were already making incredible discoveries by combining the knowledge and perspectives of different civilizations. Diseases that had been incurable for centuries were being eliminated. Environmental problems that had seemed impossible to solve were being addressed with new technologies. The most challenging task fell to Commander Phillips, who led the Federation Relief Corps. His job was to help worlds transition from imperial rule to self-governance. Some planets had never had democratic institutions and needed to learn how to hold elections and write constitutions. Others had to deal with the aftermath of centuries of oppression and exploitation. On Keth Prime, the former mining world had become a symbol of the Federation's promise. The old Kelleran miner, Doc, had been elected as the planet's first democratic leader. Under his guidance, the world was transforming from a strip-mined wasteland into a thriving agricultural center using human terraforming technology. "We used to dig holes in the ground for our masters," Doc told Jake during a visit to the planet. "Now we're planting gardens for our children. That's the difference between Empire and Federation." The transition wasn't without problems. Some worlds struggled with the concept of majority rule while protecting minority rights. Others found it difficult to break old habits of deference to authority. A few systems experienced violence as hardline imperial loyalists tried to restore the old order. But for every problem, the Federation found solutions. When ethnic tensions flared on the world of Tridax, Federation mediators helped different groups write power-sharing agreements. When pirates tried to take advantage of the transition period, Federation peacekeepers worked with local security forces to restore order. When natural disasters struck, relief ships from across the galaxy responded without being asked. Engineer Brooks had been promoted to Director of Federation Infrastructure, overseeing the massive project of connecting hundreds of worlds with faster-than-light communication networks. For the first time in galactic history, a farmer on one world could talk directly to a scientist on another world without going through imperial bureaucracy. The technology sharing had unexpected benefits. Human medical knowledge combined with Zephyrian engineering created artificial organs that could be grown in days instead of months. Kelleran agricultural techniques merged with Trilaxian water management produced crops that could grow in almost any environment. Species that had been forced to compete under the Empire now found they were stronger when they cooperated. Emperor Corthane often visited the Valiant, which had become the unofficial headquarters of the Federation government. He had developed an unlikely friendship with Jake, bonded by their shared experience of carrying the weight of billions of lives on their shoulders. "Do you ever wonder if we're making the right choice?" Corthane asked during one of their conversations. The Empire was stable even if it was oppressive. Democracy is messy and unpredictable, Jake nodded. Every day. But then I remember what we're building. We're not just creating a government. We're creating a future where every child in the galaxy can grow up free to choose their own path. That's worth a little messiness. The Federation's first major test came when the hegemony of the Outer Rim, a group of worlds that had remained independent during the Imperial period, threatened to invade several Federation worlds. The hegemony's leaders believed the Federation was weak because it relied on cooperation instead of force. Instead of responding with military action, the Federation sent a diplomatic mission led by Dr. Clark. She brought with her not threats or ultimatums, but an invitation to join the Federation and share in its benefits. The hegemony's leaders were skeptical until they saw what Federation membership had done for former Imperial worlds. Within 6 months, every world in the hegemony had voted to join the Federation. Their fleets became part of the Federation peacekeeping force, and their expertise in asteroid mining helped solve resource shortages on dozens of worlds. Lieutenant Colonel Murphy, now General Murphy, oversaw the integration of all these new members. His job was complicated by the fact that every species had different traditions and customs, but he approached each challenge with patience and respect. The Federation military became a model of diversity, with mixed crews where beings from dozens of different worlds worked together as equals. The most emotional moment came when the first ships landed on the healing Earth. The planet was still, mostly empty, its continents covered with the ruins of ancient cities, but life was returning. Automated systems left behind by humanity's greatest scientists had spent 3 centuries slowly cleaning the air and water, preparing for the day when their creators might return. Jake stood on the observation deck of a Federation ship orbiting Earth, watching as the first colonists landed. They weren't just humans, but beings from across the galaxy who wanted to help rebuild the world that had given birth to the ideals of freedom and democracy. "It's beautiful," said Commander Scott, standing beside him. "I never thought I would see a dead world come back to life." That's what we're doing across the galaxy, Jake replied. We're bringing dead hopes back to life. We're proving that the future doesn't have to be like the past. Arya, who had been given a mobile body so she could move freely around the ship, joined them at the viewport. Captain, I've been analyzing the progress reports from across the Federation. Democratic institutions are taking root faster than our most optimistic projections predicted. Jake smiled. That's because freedom is natural. It's oppression that requires constant effort to maintain. When you give people the chance to govern themselves, they usually rise to the challenge. The galaxy was indeed transforming, but the greatest transformation was in the hearts and minds of its people. Beings who had lived their entire lives in fear were learning to hope. Species that had been enemies for centuries were becoming friends. Children were growing up believing that cooperation was normal and that their voices mattered. The revolution that had begun with a simple message was becoming a new way of life for trillions of beings across the stars. The crisis began on Zerion 4, a former Imperial fortress world where tensions between different species had been building for months. The Zerions, who had served as administrators for the Empire, found themselves suddenly equal to the Meraki, workers they had oppressed for generations. Some members of both groups couldn't accept the new reality. General Murphy received the emergency call at Federation headquarters. Sir, we have reports of violence breaking out in several cities on Zerion 4. Local authorities are requesting immediate assistance. Jake Morrison, now serving as the Federation's first elected president, felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. This was exactly the kind of situation that critics had warned about. Without the Empire's iron fist to maintain order, they said, the galaxy would descend into chaos. How bad is it? Jake asked. 3 dead, dozens injured, Murphy replied. It started as a peaceful protest about work assignments, but extremists on both sides turned it violent. Commander Scott, who now led the Federation Rapid Response Team, was already preparing her ships. We can have peacekeepers on the ground in 6 hours, she said. But Jake shook his head. This isn't a military problem, it's a failure of communication. We need to address the root cause, not just the symptoms. Dr. Rodriguez, who had been working on conflict resolution protocols, suggested a different approach. Let me take a small team down there. No weapons, no uniforms, just people willing to listen and help find solutions. The situation on Zerion 4 was more complex than the initial reports had indicated. The violence hadn't started because of hatred between species, but because of fear about the future. The Zerions were afraid of losing their status and security. The Meraki were afraid that promises of equality would prove empty. Amy Rodriguez sat in a circle with representatives from both groups, along with members of other species who lived on the world. The meeting took place in a simple community center, not a government building. Everyone spoke as equals. I've worked in the administrative offices for 30 years, said Grix, a Zerion supervisor. It's all I know how to do. Under the new system, will there be a place for people like me? I spent 40 years hauling ore in the mines, replied Vok, a Meraki worker. I never learned to read because slaves weren't allowed education. How am I supposed to compete for better jobs when I don't have the skills? Amy realized that the real problem wasn't hatred, but a failure of the transition process. The Federation had focused on changing laws and government structures, but hadn't done enough to help individual people adapt to their new reality. What if we created educational programs where Zerions could teach administrative skills to Meraki, and Meraki could teach mining and engineering to Zerions? Amy suggested. Everyone has something valuable to offer. The idea was simple but revolutionary. Instead of competition, they would have cooperation. Instead of fearing each other's success, they would help each other grow. Word of the Zerion experiment spread quickly through Federation space. Other worlds began implementing similar programs. Former Imperial officers taught military strategy to planetary defense forces while learning agriculture from farmers. Scientists shared knowledge with mechanics while learning practical skills. about fixing broken equipment. Engineer Brooks, who was overseeing the Federation's infrastructure development, found that these cross-cultural exchanges were producing unexpected innovations. A mining technique developed by the Meraki, combined with Xerion administrative efficiency and human technology, created the fastest mining operation in the galaxy. But not every problem could be solved so easily. The world of Kef had been an imperial prison planet, where political dissidents from across the galaxy had been sent to die. When the Federation liberated the planet, they found survivors who had been tortured and broken by years of abuse. Dr. Clark led a medical team to Kef, but she quickly realized that the prisoners' wounds weren't just physical. Many of them had lost the ability to trust anyone in authority. They flinched when Federation officers tried to help them and refused to believe that their freedom was real. "They think this is another Imperial trick," Susan explained to Jake during a video conference. "They've been told so many lies for so long that they can't believe the truth when they hear it." The solution came from an unexpected source. Former Emperor Corthine volunteered to visit the planet and speak to the prisoners personally. Many Federation officials thought it was too dangerous, but Jake approved the mission. Corthane arrived on Kef wearing simple civilian clothes with no guards or escorts. He walked through the former prison camps and spoke to survivors in small groups. He didn't make excuses or try to justify the Empire's actions. He simply acknowledged the suffering they had endured and asked for their forgiveness. "I was the Emperor when many of you were brought here," he told them. "I could have stopped your suffering, but I chose not to. That makes me responsible for every day you spent in pain. I can't undo the past, but I can promise you that the Federation will never repeat the Empire's mistakes." The conversations were difficult and painful, but they began a healing process that couldn't have happened any other way. Seeing their former oppressor humble himself and admit his failures helped the survivors begin to believe that real change was possible. The Federation faced other challenges as well. Some worlds struggled with the economic transition from imperial tribute systems to free trade. Pirates and smugglers tried to take advantage of the more open borders. A few extremist groups attempted to restore imperial rule through terrorism. But, for every problem, the Federation found creative solutions. Economic advisors helped worlds develop new industries based on their natural resources and skills. Anti-piracy patrols were staffed by volunteers from dozens of worlds working together. Counter-terrorism efforts focused on addressing the root causes of extremism rather than just hunting down the perpetrators. The greatest challenge came from within the Federation itself. As more worlds joined and the government grew larger, some delegates began to worry that the Federation was becoming too bureaucratic. Others complained that smaller worlds didn't have enough voice in decisions that affected the entire galaxy. Jake found himself walking a careful line between efficiency and representation. The Federation had to be strong enough to maintain peace and prosperity, but flexible enough to respect the autonomy of its member worlds. The solution came during the first Constitutional Convention, held on Earth in the newly rebuilt city of New Washington. Delegates from every member world gathered to refine the Federation's governing structures. The debates were passionate but respectful, with everyone focused on finding the best solutions rather than advancing narrow interests. Commander Phillips, who had been elected as a delegate from Keth Prime, proposed a system of rotating leadership that would ensure every region of the galaxy had a voice in Federation governance. Dr. Rodriguez suggested establishing regional councils that could address local issues without waiting for action from the central government. The new constitution that emerged from the convention was more complex than the original framework, but it was also more robust. It included provisions for peaceful secession, protections for minority rights, and mechanisms for amending the government structure as the Federation continued to grow and evolve. Most importantly, it enshrined the principle that had guided the Federation from the beginning: that government derives its power from the consent of the governed, and that every sentient being has the right to participate in decisions that affect their life. As Jake signed the final version of the Constitution, he reflected on how far they had come. The galaxy that had once been ruled by fear was now governed by hope. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time in centuries, it was a future that everyone could help shape. The Federation wasn't perfect, and it never would be. But it was something better than perfection. It was alive, growing, and constantly improving. It was proof that even the darkest times could give birth to something beautiful if people were willing to work together toward a common goal. 25 years had passed since the USS Valiant emerged from its long sleep. The galaxy was unrecognizable from the empire that had once ruled through fear and oppression. Children who had been born under imperial rule were now adults who had never known anything but freedom and democracy. Jake Morrison, now in his 70s, stood on the observation deck of the Federation's starship Unity, watching the construction of Harmony Station. The massive space habitat would house the galaxy's first truly integrated community, where beings from hundreds of different species would live and work together as neighbors and friends. "It's bigger than I imagined," said Admiral Helen Scott, who had come to visit her old friend. She commanded the Federation exploration fleet now, leading expeditions to discover new worlds and new civilizations beyond the known galaxy. "Everything turned out bigger than we imagined," Jake replied with a smile. "When we first woke up, I thought we were just trying to survive. I never dreamed we'd help create something like this." The Federation had grown to include over 800 worlds and countless space habitats. Trade flowed freely between systems, carrying not just goods but ideas and culture. Art galleries on distant worlds displayed paintings by artists from dozens of species. Universities offered courses, taught by professors from across the galaxy. Children grew up learning multiple languages and considering diversity normal rather than threatening. Dr. Rodriguez, now director of the Federation Academy of Sciences, had just published a paper on breakthrough research into faster-than-light communication. Teams of scientists from 50 different species had worked together for a decade to solve problems that no single civilization could have tackled alone. "We're close to real-time communication across the entire galaxy," Amy told Jake during their weekly video call. "Think about what that means for democracy. Every citizen will be able to participate in government discussions regardless of how far away they live." The political evolution of the Federation had been remarkable to watch. What had started as a simple democracy had grown into something much more sophisticated. Local communities governed themselves through direct participation, while regional councils handled larger issues, and the galaxy-wide government focused only on matters that affected everyone. Former Emperor Corthane, now 90 years old, spent his time writing memoirs that had become required reading in schools across the Federation. His books about the transition from empire to democracy were studied by political scientists and used as guides by new worlds joining the Federation. "I was an emperor who ruled through fear," he had written in his most famous work. But Jake Morrison showed me that true leadership comes from inspiring people to be their best selves, not from forcing them to obey out of terror. Commander Phillips had been elected president of the Federation 3 times, each term bringing new innovations in governance. His administration had established the Galactic Peace Corps, which sent volunteers to help developing worlds build infrastructure and institutions. The Corps was so popular that there was a waiting list of young beings from across the galaxy who wanted to serve. Engineer Brooks had revolutionized space travel with his development of the quantum tunnel network. Ships could now travel between major systems in hours instead of weeks, making the galaxy feel smaller and more connected than ever before. Trade, tourism, and cultural exchange flourished as never before. The greatest symbol of the Federation's success was Earth itself. The planet that had been left as a dead rock by the Empire was now a thriving world again. But it wasn't just a human world anymore. Representatives from every Federation member species had helped rebuild the planet as a symbol of their shared values. New York had been reconstructed as a monument to diversity, with buildings designed by architects from dozens of different cultures. The Amazon had been replanted as a collaborative garden where botanists from across the galaxy grew crops that could feed populations on hostile worlds. The former sites of ancient cities had become parks where families from different species came to vacation together. But the Federation's greatest achievement wasn't any particular project or institution. It was the transformation of how beings throughout the galaxy thought about each other. The old imperial mindset of superior and inferior species had been replaced by a recognition that everyone had something valuable to contribute. Jake often received messages from young beings who had been inspired by the story of humanity's return. A Zephyrian poet had written an epic poem about the day the Valiant emerged from hiding. A Calliran composer had created a symphony celebrating the first Federation assembly. A Meraki inventor had named her daughter Hope in honor of the change that humanity had brought to the galaxy. "Do you think we succeeded?" Admiral Scott asked as they watched construction crews from a dozen different species working together to install the station's central habitat ring. Jake considered the question carefully. "We succeeded in proving that change is possible. We showed that beings who have been enemies can become friends. We demonstrated that cooperation is stronger than conquest. But success isn't a destination, Helen. It's a journey that each generation has to choose to continue." The challenges facing the Federation were different from those of the early years, but they were still real. Climate change threatened several worlds. Population growth strained resources in some systems. New technologies raised questions about privacy and individual rights. External threats from unexplored regions of the galaxy occasionally tested the Federation's defenses. But the Federation had built institutions and traditions that could handle these challenges without abandoning its core principles. Problems were solved through open debate, scientific research, and collaborative effort. When mistakes were made, they were acknowledged and corrected rather than covered up or ignored. General Murphy, now retired but still active as an elder statesman, often spoke to military academies about the difference between Imperial and Federation approaches to security. "The Empire tried to create safety through strength," he would tell young officers. "The Federation creates safety through friendship. A galaxy where everyone prospers is a galaxy where everyone is secure." As Jake prepared to step down from his role as President Emeritus, he reflected on the path that had brought them all to this point. It had started with a simple decision, to choose hope over hatred, understanding over vengeance. It had continued with countless small choices by ordinary beings who decided to trust each other rather than fear each other. The USS Valiant had been decommissioned as a warship and converted into a museum and research facility. Visitors from across the galaxy came to see the ship that had changed everything, but also to learn about the values that had made that change possible. The ship's motto, displayed prominently in the main gallery, captured the essence of what humanity had contributed to the galaxy. Not through conquest, but through character. Aria, now running on quantum processors that spanned multiple star systems, had evolved far beyond her original programming. She had become something like the galaxy's collective memory, maintaining the historical record and helping coordinate the vast network of information that kept the Federation functioning. "Captain Morrison," Aria said during their final official conversation, "your species taught the galaxy something that no amount of technology could have provided. You taught us that the future doesn't have to repeat the past." Jake smiled at the AI who had awakened with him so many years ago. "We all taught each other, Aria. That's what made it work." On his final day in office, Jake stood before the Federation Assembly one last time. Representatives from hundreds of worlds filled the Great Hall, their different forms and features a testament to the diversity that had become the Federation's greatest strength. "When we first emerged from our long sleep," Jake said, "we thought we were the last humans in the galaxy. We thought our species was finished, but we learned something important. Humanity isn't a species. It's an idea. It's the belief that every sentient being deserves dignity, freedom, and the chance to shape their own destiny. He looked out at the sea of faces, representing creatures that had once been strangers or enemies to each other. You have all become human in the deepest sense of the word. You have chosen to build rather than destroy, to unite rather than divide, to hope rather than despair. The future of the galaxy is in good hands because it's in your hands. As Jake left the podium for the last time, the assembly rose in respectful silence. They were honoring not just one man, but the choice that all of them had made to create a better future together. Outside the assembly hall, construction on Harmony Station continued. Children from different worlds played together in the temporary parks. Artists collaborated on sculptures that combined multiple cultural traditions. Scientists worked late into the night on projects that would benefit everyone. The galaxy had indeed fallen without a single shot being fired. But what had risen in its place was something far greater than any empire. A community of beings who had chosen to reach for the stars together rather than fight over the ashes of the past. Humanity had returned to the galaxy not as conquerors, but as gardeners, planting seeds of hope that would continue to grow long after the last human had passed into history.